Okay, thank you, everybody. Um, that was fun. Okay, sorry, we'll start again. So, Scope 2 guidance and how your carbon reporting is going to change. As I said, this is another in a series of webinars from us here at SustainIt. Um, Obviously, the changes are going to affect an awful lot of what happens in terms of corporate social responsibility reporting. And so we wanted to take an opportunity to talk through that and to give you guys some ideas of what's going to happen, how it's going to change what you do, and how you can adapt what you do to cope with it. So really, it's as simple as that. If we fly through, I realize I've just wasted about 8 minutes of my time, and I don't want to waste any of David's, so we'll go through here. David, I thought this might be a nice opportunity for you to introduce yourself.
Great, thanks, Joe.
Yeah.
Hi, so I'm David Wynn. I'm the head of client services at Greenstone. So just to give a brief introduction, we're a specialist non-financial reporting software company. So we provide software for organizations to help them track their non-financial reporting. So to help them calculate their carbon emissions and their environmental data, but also their health and safety, CSR, and supply chain information. In an online platform. So we provide software and then the supporting services. So Joe's going to give an introduction to the changes in guidance, and then later on I'll be taking you through some kind of practical examples of what our clients are doing and their experiences of trying to interpret the new Scope 2 guidance.
Thanks, David. So we'll spend as well a moment talking a little bit about SustainIt. So we are a sustainability data consultancy. We have been around for nearly 10 years now. We help our clients with understanding the kind of information they have access to for CSR, for EHS, for corporate social responsibility, and we help them understand how to use that effectively. And that can be everything from materiality analysis and setting ambitions right the way through to finding a way of collecting and managing and using that data effectively. And when we talk about some of our larger clients, and obviously we're showing off a little bit here with some of those, then that conversation becomes about technology and about how to use specialist software like Greenstone Plus to collect that data and use that data effectively. So Scope 2 and the new guidance, and let's have a talk about that. So what is a Scope 2 emission? And hopefully, I think most of you probably already know this, but I'm going to very quickly recap what is a Scope 2 emission. So typically, it will cover electricity, steam, and district heating. And of those, obviously, the one that everyone's most interested in, because it's the one that everybody uses, is electricity. The easiest way of defining what a Scope 2 emission is if you're using energy, but you don't generate that energy on site, then that's a Scope 2 emission. So things like gas, coal, things that you burn on site or within your facility, those are Scope 1 emissions. We're not talking about those. A Scope 2 emission is something that you generate off-site but use on-site. And obviously, it's a major part of anyone's carbon impact. Globally, they think around about a third of all carbon emissions that are kind of reported on are categorized as Scope 2, so it is a big chunk. Obviously, before we start digging into Scope 3, which is a whole other thing. So Scope 2 really is a big part of everyone's energy usage. And the idea behind the new guidance is really about finding ways to effectively report on reducing Scope 2 emissions. And there's all kinds of ways you can do it. And obviously we've thrown up three there, which are, I think, all pretty obvious. There's energy conservation, using less, being more efficient, just in what you do, turning the lights off when you leave the office, things like that. And that obviously has an impact. There's efficiency upgrades as well. Things like, the obvious one for everybody, I'm sure, is installing LED lighting. Again, it's a way to reduce the amount of electricity you use. And then finally, there's better, and I suppose that could almost be in inverted commas, better energy sourcing. And I think that's one of the areas that really this guidance is designed to address. I think it's giving you the ability to take those. Yes, David has just reminded me, and I'll very quickly stop and do a bit of the housework that really I should have done while I was trying to get the slides to display. If you do have any questions, there is time at the end. We will get to them. If you can send them to myself or to David via the chat function, and we'll pick those up and we'll use them at the end. Sorry, I should have mentioned that earlier. Thanks, David, for the reminder. So, what is the new guidance? Well, this came out in January 2015, so we've had nearly 12 months to digest it now. And it outlines how to report more effectively on the true emissions of your operations. I think, for me, the real key behind this new guidance from the WRI is that it's trying to crack a nut that we've seen our clients struggle with over the years, which is how do you get due credit for the energy efficiency work you're doing in terms of things like energy sourcing. So things like PPAs and RECs and ROs and generation, all the kind of abbreviations that we're all very much fans of. But if you are, as a company, sourcing energy that has a lower carbon intensity, if you're sourcing renewable energy, then how do you report on that effectively? How do you get due credit for that work? And so the last thing there is that CDP 2016, the questionnaire has been updated, as it is every year, and so it's another thing to consider when it comes down to looking at whether or not you're going to move to the new guidance. You will be more in line with CDP if you do that, so obviously an advantage. So the big terms that are in this guidance are location and market-based emissions. And the one to get your head around really is market-based. So what is a market-based emission? So up until now, most Scope 2 reporting has used national or regional level emission factors. We've all seen the spreadsheets that DEFRA and GHG Protocol have available, where you have country by country and in some cases state by state emission factors for your Scope 2 energy, for your electricity, for your district heating, for so on. And that's kind of been the kind of broad de facto emission factors that have been used, which has been fine. But suppliers' own emissions can be, significantly different. In the UK, we've got companies like Ecotricity and Good Energy who source all their electricity from renewable sources. As well, you've got, things like on-site generation now having a huge impact. So by giving people the opportunity to use these contractual instruments, then you can start to report a set of emissions that more closely match your true emissions rather than just a national average. And that's really what it's about. It's about giving you the opportunity to show where your Scope 2 emissions are different to what is actually kind of viewed as the grid average for the regions for your operations. And when we're talking about large multinationals, obviously that impact can add up pretty fast. So what's changing? Why is it important? You can see as well, I apologize, I do have a bit of a Lego thing going on at the moment. So do you have to report two numbers? Kind of. Basically, using location and market-based emissions gives you real opportunity to be very, very clear on where what you are doing is different from just the grid average. And that's the important thing that you get to put out there as a very clear statement. This is different to the grid average. This is where it's different. This is why it's different. These are the choices we're making. And I think that third point is probably the clearest one, I would say. It gives you recognition of the positive energy choices made by your company. It gives you the ability to be very, very clear about how the different things you've done are impacting your Scope 2 emissions. I think that's quite an important thing. So for both location and market-based emissions, WRI have given very clear guidance as to what each are, and each one has a very clear hierarchy. So you go down the list and you choose the highest up one that you can. So when you're calculating your location-based emissions, then first up is the regional or subnational. So I always use, for some reason, Canada, with British Columbia and Alberta as an example, where they have very different emission factors for their Scope 2 because they have different generation profiles. So you would use those. If those aren't available, you default to a national emission factor. And then you go. Simple as that. And really for market-based, it's a similar process. You start at the top of the list and you go down until you find the one you have. So you start with energy attribute certificates. You go down to contracts from specified sources. If you don't have those, maybe your supplier has got their own emission rate. I know in the UK that's certainly the case, that most energy suppliers will give you an emission rate. And lastly, you're back to the residual mix or the grid average, which is essentially you're back into location-based emissions at that point. Obviously, the energy attribute certificates will most likely give you something that's much lower in terms of emission factor, much more accurate, so on and so on. So there we go. Key points to remember. Make sure that your contractual instruments are up to scratch. So the guidance that's come out from the WRI isn't the most exciting read in the world, but it is very clear in terms of what they consider for each layer. And so that's really powerful to have. It's a really useful tool to go through. The executive summary, I think, is quite nice in that it makes it clear without being too weighty. So it's worth having a look. You do need to recalculate your baseline, and it always makes life fun, I realize. But it is a case then of looking back at how it's affected your data year on year on year, because it's about having a consistent platform for reporting. And I think the most important one for me certainly is that companies can choose which approach they use for targets and benchmarking. So when you start to look at targets, instead of setting targets using national and grid averages, which you know are incorrect and which you know energy managers and facilities guys have worked hard to drop away from and to get more efficient from, then you can use the market-based approach to ensure that the targets and the benchmarks you're setting are more appropriate to your own business. It gives you a much greater level of nuance to what you're doing. I think that's, again, really powerful and really useful. So, and this I've pinched straight from the WRI guidance. I thought it was a very useful slide because it just shows you this is how your emissions can be made to look very different. You can see that through the use of RECs and through PPAs, our example sites here have completely eliminated their scope 2 emissions in both the USA and Mexico. They've massively addressed their emissions in India, but it also shows that there's more to it. The residual mix that their supplier in Norway is using is actually higher than the location average, and so there is, again, there is that more nuance. And then China is China, and so they've got location-based emissions, and that's what they've had to default back to. But overall, you can see the system put in place and the framework gives you a much more interesting picture, a much more nuanced picture of your scope 2 emissions. And I think that's, from our perspective, one of the most exciting things about it. Okay, so now that we've talked a little bit about what the guidance is and what's going to change, I now have to entrust my presentation rights to David, and we will then allow him to take over. David, it's over to you.
Great, thanks, Joe.
No problem at all.
So I'll just share my screen just to check that everyone can now see that. Great, thanks. So thanks to Joe for giving a bit of an introduction to the new guidance, and also for inviting us along to speak at the SustainIt webinar today. So what I'm going to take you through is a little case study of one of our clients in terms of how they've been implementing using the new Scope 2 guidance, and then hopefully a bit of insight on some of the key challenges. So we've had a handful of clients that have started to look at this year, and it's the first time really trying to get to grips with what they're doing. Then talk about software. So as I mentioned, Greenstone, we're a software company, so having a look at how software can help with reporting Scope 2, and then hopefully to just close off some lessons learned in terms of implementing the new guidance. So what I've got here is I've taken a case study. So as I mentioned, Joe sort of went through January of this year was when the new guidance came out. So we ran a few sort of training webinars for our clients and also externally earlier in the year to try and help people sort of understand how to implement the guidance. And as I say, we've had clients in the last few months that have started to look at how they can actually implement this. So I've anonymized who it is, obviously for sensitive reasons, but have just taken the sort of profile of a particular client that we have. They have 7 sites across 3 countries. So they've got 3 offices in the UK, 3 in America, and they've got 1 in France. And they've got more that will be coming online in France next year. So historically, this is what their footprinting looked like in terms of taking a location-based approach to reporting. For their 3 UK sites, they've got their consumption information, and they were applying the DEFRA emissions factors that are published for the UK to get their location-based carbon footprint. Similarly, for France, they were using Bilan Carbon emissions factors to get their carbon footprint for there. And for the US, they were using the eGrid emissions factors, which are the most sort of accurate based on grid boundaries in the US. So this is what they did last year for their footprint, and then so using this year's consumption data for their electricity, similarly they've got their location-based footprint. So in terms of how that's changed, as Joe's kind of gone through, we've now got this market-based approach as well that influences what this company now has to report. So for their 3 UK sites, for 2 of them, they don't have anything in terms of instruments around their electricity. They use the standard grid electricity for them, so they'll continue to use. So they have nothing in the market-based, and they continue to report the location-based approach. For 1 of their sites, however, they do have emissions factors that are provided from the supplier. So they have a green tariff supplier of electricity. So they received the CO2 information directly from that supplier. So that's plugged in as 0.9 in the market-based approach. In France, they have a guarantee of origin. So across the EU, there's EU legislation that countries have to implement a guarantees of origin system for tracking electricity supply. And so for the market-based emissions for the French site is 0, so they report that as 0. If they didn't have that guarantee of origin, then best practice would be to use the residual mix emissions factor. And I'll go into a little bit more detail on that in a second, because that's something that's come out as being a sticking point for certain people looking at this when they get down to the kind of nitty-gritty. For our US locations, they've got renewable energy certificates. For the first location, they don't cover the whole site, so the certificates only cover part of it, which is why the emissions are lower, but they're not 0. So that's why you've got this 2.2. Whereas for their second site, the renewable energy certificate is 100%, so that covers the whole of that location. And for the third site, they don't have anything, so that takes the eGrid emissions factor from location-based. So just to try and make things clear here, the market-based emissions are here, and then what's actually reported in terms of their kind of new Scope 2 footprint is in this third column here. So you'll see initially the first priority is this market-based, and then when there's no alternative, we revert back to the location-based figures. So hopefully that's clear and helpful. And the difficult thing with this is that it's obviously different for every client. So if there are specific queries on it, then it's important to ask people about it and check that you're actually reporting it in the right way. So just in terms of the key challenges that we've seen from people trying to use the new Scope 2 guidance approach, the first one is around the quality criteria. So within the guidance, if you're using and reporting any of these market-based things, obviously there has to be transparency and robustness around what those things are. So within the guidance, I'll just pull this out. There's quality criteria for the contractual instruments. So there's a few things on this list here, but this is a really important section of the guidance. And if you do think that you have renewable energy certificates or guarantees of origin or anything like that that falls within the framework, then you need to ask these questions to make sure that you fulfill the quality criteria to report that information. So a lot of the questions that we've been getting are, does this count as an instrument? And so this is the sort of 8 questions that you need to then refer to determine whether it falls under the market-based approach. Other key challenges are the new reporting new boundaries and methodologies. So as with any of this kind of GHG reporting space, whenever there's changes in methodologies, it's important to communicate that. Firstly, obviously understand the implications for your organization and whether you fall into it, but then also coming up with a strategy for how you're going to actually communicate what those changes mean. It could be that if you, as an organization, change to a market-based approach, then overnight your scope 2 emissions could be 0. So that's good in some respects, but it's obviously challenging in terms of how you report that externally and also internally as well. And that ties into the rebaselining. So as part of this process, it's definitely rebaselining is something that you would want to consider because it could have such a big impact on your scope 2 emissions. And for a lot of organizations, those are obviously one of the biggest contributors to their overall footprint. And again, it's the key thing around this, I think, is around being transparent about what's the foundation for having a new base year and rebaselining, and explaining the rationale behind that. That's sort of key. The other impact, of course, is around goal setting and targets. So lots of organizations will have targets around reducing their emissions. If they then switch to a market-based approach, again, that might have a very material impact on their scope 2 emissions, which could skew targets that have been put in place. So with that piece, I think what's key is to have a look at where you are in terms of any public targets or internal targets that you've set, and those benchmarking pieces. It might make sense to continue to use those based on the location-based emissions factors if they're already in place and you're working towards those on emissions. But generally, I would say the best practice is a dual reporting approach and to use both side by side. So just on that, I just thought it would be useful to have a look again at this hierarchy, particularly on the market-based, in terms of some of the kind of key questions that we've been getting from clients around this. So on the traditional location-based, the main question that comes up around this, because people tend to be more familiar with it, is the difference between regional and subnational and national emissions factors. And obviously there's a size, because the emissions factors that are produced for regional and subnational for a smaller area and are more accurate. But the key distinction here is that those regional and subnational emissions factors, they're based on grid boundaries. So, for example, the US grid emissions factors, they're based on that grid boundary. On the flip side, the national emissions factors that are published are based on geographical boundaries. So they do tend to be less accurate. So that's the distinction there between those. So more importantly, and slightly more confusingly, on the market-based side, I've just put a few examples here of some of the instruments that have been put in the guidance, and some of the key ones that we've seen coming through in terms of working with clients to understand what instruments do and don't fall under this market-based approach. So the renewable energy certificates attribute certificates, sorry, there's some examples there, and they're relatively established as mechanisms for reporting. On the contracts for electricity, power purchase agreements, just one thing to note there is that that's not necessarily renewables. So it might be that it could be that covers coal, for example, in a US location, and it gives a specific emissions factor or emissions, but it's not necessarily zero, and it's not necessarily related to renewables. The other interesting thing that has come up a few times is around residual mix and grid averages, and the difference between using the residual mix and using location-based emissions factors. So probably the EU residual mix is probably the most established in terms of looking at this. So there's a set of emissions factors that are published for the EU, different countries, that take into account what's referred to as this residual mix. And what that means is that they are emissions factors, but instead of just being the location-based, what they do is they take into account these other three priorities. So if there are certificates on the market that say, I am procuring electricity from my suppliers and there's zero emissions associated with that, then all of those are scooped up and removed from the national emissions factor. So it generally means what happens is that the residual mix emissions factor is higher, because it means that all of those certificates and low carbon procurement contracts that are made are removed from it, and therefore for everybody else they get a higher emissions factor. So if you are using this market-based approach, and say for example you have 10 offices across the EU, which this is an example actually from one of our clients, where they've got lots of different offices across the EU, and only a couple of them have certificates. So they've got renewable energy certificates under the Guarantees of Origin scheme, but for the other countries they should be using the EU residual mix factor, which means actually their emissions in those countries is increasing. So that's something that's come up, and it's something that's sort of key to consider when you are looking at reporting a market-based approach. So I'll just go on to now the software piece. I want to leave enough time for questions in terms of taking those from the audience. But just to take you through the sort of how to use software, this sort of diagram here takes you through what the key steps would be in terms of implementing Scope 2. So obviously, first of all, is identifying what emission sources are Scope 2. So for most organizations, hopefully that should be relatively straightforward. The next step then, determining whether the market-based approach actually applies to you. So if you're in a market where you have choice around electricity, then it applies to you. So there may be certain countries where there's no choice around electricity suppliers, but for most main markets there will be, in which case potentially you may be able to use the market-based approach. You then need to collect the activity data and choose emissions factors for each methodology that you're going to apply, and then calculate the emissions. So in a software scenario, that would be uploading the emissions to a system that would then calculate the location-based emissions for you. And where you have any market-based emissions, those can be uploaded at the same time so that you can report them side by side. And then finally rolling up those emissions into the wider GHG footprint of the organization. So I've just got an example here of what that practically means. So from a software perspective, we implemented at the beginning of this year a mechanism for reporting market-based emissions. So you'll see here where this red box is, as well as inputting your consumption and cost information. You can also input your market-based emissions if you have those from a supplier, and record what instrument types you have related to that information. that then pulls through to a series of dashboards and reports to sort of help you analyze and report that information. I guess the key thing here is collecting all of the supporting information. So you saw previously around the quality criteria, and with this market-based data, yes, it's about the numbers in terms of the emissions that might be able to be provided from a supplier, but it's also about the supporting information around that as well, and making sure that you have all of that supplementary information stored in the system or stored in one place, so that you have that as an audit trail. And that obviously becomes more important if you go down the route of verification. So schemes like CDP are often a driver for organizations to verify the data, as well as just good practice and treating your data with the same robustness that you would treat financial data. So having somewhere to store all of that information and a clear audit trail of both location and market-based calculations is key. And as I say, that pulls through to the data audit piece and having that transparency around which of the locations you have market-based and which don't, and how they complement each other for your sort of overall footprinting. So just final thoughts from me before I pass back to Joe to pick up some questions. In terms of the clients that we've worked with, some of the key learning points, I would say, firstly, obviously read the guidance. There's a video and there's an exec summary online, but the document itself, just to go through that. Speak to energy managers and people that look after the energy. And importantly, do that early. It may take a bit of time to sort of try and identify which locations you're working with, across your organization might have this information. So, and also having clear communications with them about what you're actually looking for. So a conversation with offices in the US will be about renewable energy certificates, as opposed to in other countries where it might be a different mechanism, and being clear on what information you have. Again, establish that baseline procedure and a clarity around how you're going to communicate the rationale behind that. And then build any of those changes required into the data gathering and the reporting process or software. So making sure that you have a capability to collect that information, but also all that metadata information as well about where the actual data information is coming from. And just as a final thought from me around the whole Scope 2 piece, and also more broadly in this space, is transparency, in terms of just being as transparent as possible as what information you have. If you're not going to be using the market-based approach, then be clear why that is. As Joe said, the guidance was published in January of this year, and it's recommended that people implement it from the next reporting cycle. So ideally, whenever your next reporting cycle is, you should be looking to try and use the market-based approach. CDP will be doing it from the beginning of next year, so anybody reporting to that will be having questions about if they're using it, how they're using it. So yes, I would say engage with it, and if you don't have it, if you're not using it and you don't have it, or you're lacking in information or to do it, then being transparent about that is very important. So there's just some final thoughts from me. I will pass back to Joe, who